Well, thank you very much for being here. It is great to see such an audience on a Wednesday evening at King's for what promises to be a fascinating discussion. I'm not quite sure I knew it was a debate, but a discussion on the upcoming elections in Moldova and Georgia, right? That's why we're all. I'm a professor of Russian politics, so I don't know. You can read into what it means that the professor of Russian politics is sharing a panel on the U.S. elections. But they do concentrate the mind, regardless of what it is that you work on. And we've got an excellent panel to help us pick apart some of these issues, focusing on are coming from a number of different disciplinary and professional perspectives. So starting from my left, first of all, you'll have full bios up on the screen, so I won't spend too much time on this, but Adam Quinn is Associate Professor of American Foreign Policy and Grand Strategy at the University of Birmingham. Kat Lee, welcome back to King's, is a KCL alumni in the Masters in Terrorism, Security and Society program, and is currently an international trade analyst at the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agencies. Welcome back. Dr. Elizabeth Ingleson is Assistant Professor of U.S. Foreign Relations and U.S.-China Relations at the LSE. Josephine Harmon is Assistant Professor at Northeastern University and Research Fellow at Queen Mary University here in London. And then last but not least, our own Stephen Hunsaker from the UK and a Changing Europe think tank here at King's. So with that, Adam, one way or another, right, I think somewhat unexpectedly, we're going to have a different administration in Washington come January. So just to get us started, what lessons would you expect a Harris and a Trump administration to learn from the experience of the Biden administration in the last 4 years? And how might those lessons differ across the candidates?
Well, thanks for having me here. I don't live in London anymore, but it's nice to be back. I did go to grad school at the LSE, so I'm afraid I'm on the wrong side of what I know is an important divide, but everyone's been very nice to me so far, and I hope will continue to be so. Well, I'm tempted to say when it comes to the lesson for Harris, the trite answer would be don't have a president who's a million years old, and who therefore struggles quite badly sometimes to articulate and defend the program and the platform of his own administration, because obviously it's been an enormous difficulty for the Biden administration that that's been the case. And it will kind of resolve itself because Kamala Harris is about to turn 60 and she's a young 60 and so will be more capable. But a more sort of substantive and serious answer, I guess I would say, there's been a long-running trend of realignment in the party coalitions. The Democratic Party coalition used to be very much the party of the blue-collar working class, including the white working class. And there's been a sense that that's been coming apart. They've been losing that portion of their support. It's been, especially in the Trump era, notable. It's been moving over to him. And there was a theory on the progressive side of politics that if you made a strong bid to meet the material interests of the white working class, you could get those voters back who might not care for all of the social positions of the Democratic Party, but you could make them a kind of kitchen table sale. And the Biden administration, although Biden himself was not the most progressive candidate in the primary contest he won, his administration was populated by a lot of people who did believe that. And the administration has followed through in a lot of ways. They passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which despite the name was mostly about funneling new investment into technology and climate change related transition, which would have put a lot of money into American industry. The CHIPS Act, which is a kind of balancing against China investment in technology as well. All of it very good for American manufacturing, American technology, those kinds of voters, those kinds of places. But those kinds of voters really still seem to love Trump as we go into this very close election. I mean, a little vignette that kind of illustrates this. The Teamsters Union, which is a sort of truckers union that has a long-standing history of endorsing the Democratic Party, their pension scheme got bailed out directly by a choice that the Biden administration made, to the tune, I think, when someone ran the numbers, of about $100,000 per member of that pension scheme, and then the union declined to endorse Kamala Harris in this election. And that's a kind of small-scale, maybe, illustration of the difficulty of making that kind of progressive bid to win back the part of the Democratic Party coalition that was being lost. So I think one lesson that will have been learned there is that there's something bigger, deeper, more structural going on. It means the Democratic Party is becoming the party of the college graduate, the intellectual elite, the white-collar worker, and it's not going to be enough simply to invest government money into things that benefit the white working class to win them back, because they care about various culture wars, if you want to be pejorative issues. They care about immigration. There are reasons why it's going to be difficult to do that. With regard to the Trump administration, I'm going to cheat slightly on your question and say that the main lesson he's going to learn is going to come from his own previous tenure as president rather than Biden as such. Because I think last time he was in office, he was very inexperienced. He didn't have a lot of knowledge of government. I think that was fairly clear to anyone who did have knowledge of government who listened to him talk. And as a result, when he came into office, he didn't know how the institutions worked oftentimes. Those institutions were populated by people who didn't like his policies and wanted to make them go slow. Even with his own political appointees, because he wasn't someone who had built a team behind him previously, he often appointed people who didn't agree with him in policy terms to a lot of positions. So between not having people who wanted to even try to implement his policies and then having a government machine that was disinclined to implement them once he did sort of try, there were a lot of things where he got started, didn't really get anywhere. It wasn't a very productive administration in a lot of ways. You may have heard of Project 2025. This is a thing put out by the Heritage Foundation think tank, but a bit controversial how much it is the exact manifesto of the Trump administration, because they've tried to distance themselves from it, but it's produced by a bunch of people who are very definitely intimately linked with the Trump administration, so we reasonably think it is a kind of agenda in waiting for them. One reason why that's been controversial is because the policy content is very conservative in quite a long document. But another part of it, or another angle, is about ensuring that the way they approach the machinery of government, if Trump is re-elected, is much more effective this time. You know the key positions in government where you need the right people who are going to be efficacious in trying to do the right thing, so that you draft things properly, they don't get struck down by the courts. And you don't get people in various positions in government who are obstructing you. So to the extent that the previous Trump administration kind of might have encouraged a bit of complacency that even if he's president, a lot of the stuff he spouts off about isn't going to happen, he's going to come in much better prepared with people who have been investing time in being better prepared around him to actually make his spouting reality. And that could make for a very different, and if you don't like it, more worrying Trump too, if it happens.
Thank you. There's a lot of threads on there that we will pick up on. But I want to turn first, sticking on the foreign policy side, to Elizabeth, if I might. Biden has somewhat, oddly, given what Adam was just describing, pivoted the U.S. towards a more protectionist stance when it comes to trade. Part, indeed, of what he did with the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the otherwise progressive measures that he pursued. And in some ways, that was a continuation of the Trump administration. Right? So is this pivot towards protectionism something that's sustainable, and what kind of a challenge does that create for those of us who have to deal with America and the world?
Look, I think there are a couple of things. There are two key points I want to make on this issue of protectionism and what it means. But I also want to begin, actually, just having listened to what you were saying, Adam, with a comment about the kind of rhetorical power that American politics continues to sort of lie within in terms of a vision of what a working class American looks like. So it's this idea of the Teamsters Union or the idea of a manufacturing worker has such incredibly potent political power in American political culture right now that so much of the actions and decisions that are being debated and that happened both under the Trump administration and more recently under the Biden administration in terms of tariffs specifically has been based upon this idea, right? This idea of a sort of white male working class individual who's within sort of a manufacturing sector or the Teamsters. This is a very mid-20th century vision of what work looks like. And it doesn't stick with reality. And so the 2 points that I wanted to make, the second of which, I'll start with the second, is that if we look at what work and labour looks like within the United States, the manufacturing sector, in terms of employment, is very, very small, or relatively small compared to other aspects. So it's about 10% of American GDP. I have my stats here, and 8.2% of employment. The vast majority of workers, the vast majority of the working class within the United States is in the service sector. The vast majority of GDP production is in the service sector. Again, I've got my stats written down so I'm not wrong. 70% of GDP is in the service sector. 80 to 85% of employment is in the service sector within the United States. And so we have a real disconnect between the realities of what it means to be working class or even middle class within the United States and the rhetorical stasis that both sides of politics are continuing to sort of benefit from, not just propagate, but benefit from. And the stasis is this mid-20th century vision when American workforce did look different and manufacturing sector within the United States did have a larger proportion of employment as well as GDP growth. So the second key thing I want to say in terms of sort of connecting this to foreign policy, the particular focus of my own research, is that there is a really quite concerning impact, not only in terms of what this sort of ideal of a worker within the United States is, and the disconnect with reality. The other real concern is that it's having quite profound impacts upon American foreign policy. And we're seeing that specifically in the US-China case with tariffs, which were imposed under the Trump administration and have increased under the Biden administration. So I think if we think about the sort of repercussions of this current election, there are very significant differences between both candidates and what would happen in terms of tariffs specifically and US-China relations more broadly. But what is forgotten in these conversations about tariffs and these conversations about imposing them as a form of protecting American manufacturing is that American manufacturing is very, very high. American manufacturing is the second largest in the whole world. It's the employment that is small. American manufacturing, as I mentioned, is about 8% of total American employment. So what has gone down since mid-20th century in the United States has not been manufacturing itself, but rather, and especially relative to the rest of the world, but rather the employment. And so these tariffs are being imposed upon China and being talked about. You know, Trump talks about if he gets into office, he'll have these flat 60% is his current number. It changes. The 60% tariffs on Chinese goods, etc. What these policy implications are is that they're not addressing this disconnect I mentioned earlier. They're not addressing the really fundamental realities of American society, but they're also not addressing the realities of the global international economic order, which, as we're familiar with, is so deeply entwined, so deeply reliant on supply chains. We've lived through COVID. We know about supply chains, and yet somehow the reality of supply chains, the reality of offshore manufacturing, the reality of something that says it's made in China, we know is not only made in China. We know that there are significant other steps along the way, in the same way that something made in America is not fully made in America. Biden's own policies saying, you know, I want a made in America policy, only stipulated that something had to have 55% made in America to be labelled made in America. So we know this, and yet the politics remains potent enough to be speaking of tariffs and slapping tariffs on. And what, just to conclude, what this does is that it leads to reactions. So it encourages China to respond. We're seeing that here in Europe, with China imposing tariffs upon European whiskey and on petrol cars. We see that with export controls that China is now imposing on certain minerals that are used in making chips. So this sort of policy of imposing tariffs isn't addressing the problem it purports to address, which is employment within the United States. And it's escalating tensions and responses in a way that is unhelpful for a larger bilateral relationship with China. So I'm going to leave it there and hope to continue the conversation.
Thank you for that. So, Elizabeth and Adam, you both picked up on the sense of insecurity that is enabling some of these campaigns and driving this election. It strikes me that Americans seem motivated perhaps more than usual by a deep sense of insecurity, and it sort of pervades a number of issues. So, crime and guns and migration and just sort of this general sense of impending doom in a world that seems to be coming apart at the seams. Can either candidate actually make Americans safer as opposed to just making them feel safer?
Is this for all of us?
Oh, sorry, for Josephine, sorry.
Oh, this is for me.
Yes, sorry.
I was wondering about that.
Sorry.
No, thank you very much, Sam. And pleasure likewise to be here. Well, I think your question about safety comes down to visions of what it means for America to be safe. And it seems to me that America, which was already a very polarized country prior to Trump's arrival in 2015, 2016, has become even more politically polarized. And that, to me, is the fundamental issue here, that both political sides here are seeking a vision of America that is fundamentally incompatible. You cannot have the two together. You cannot have gun liberalization and strengthening gun rights for individuals in order to protect. These are two visions of what safety and self-protection means. So I think the salient issue here is that there is a buying into a political program for both Trump and for Harris that are fundamentally paradoxical, fundamentally even contradictory. And I think the GOP base's response to Trump's the assassination attempt on Trump was an indication of that. Here was the shooting of a political candidate, which I don't think anybody supported, and the reaction amongst Trump's base was not, let's impose stricter gun measures. It was a point about the left and this notion about political conspiracy. So I think that's the first thing, is that there's a fundamental shift, a fundamental gap between these two visions of what both sides want within their own country, and they have to cohabit and live in the same house together, essentially. And I think that relates to this broader point that we have here two hugely different characters, two hugely different individuals. And there's real love for Trump, I think, on one level. And that comes to this point about motivation, that both sides, I think particularly after Harris entered the race and Biden dropped out, there seems to be a pickup in liberal enthusiasm for this fresher, younger candidate when it became unsustainable, essentially, for Biden to continue his candidacy. And so there is this really potent sense of motivation amongst the Trump base. I think it was a Deutsche Welle report this week where there's a restaurant somewhere in the States called Trump Burger, where they serve burgers with Trump stamped on the top of it. And I thought that's a very strange thing to eat, which is perhaps a very liberal, cosmopolitan thing to think. And so I think he's become this symbol of America, and perhaps always was, perhaps for decades has become this symbol of what it means, to be American. And he's perceived in a fundamentally different oppositional way by liberals and conservatives. To conservatives, he's a symbol of making it, of the American dream. And I was rereading American Psycho, the novel, recently, the Bret Easton Ellis novel, and Trump is referenced quite a lot in that novel as a kind of symbol of psychopathic yuppie greed. So I think that's a fundamentally interesting thing, is Trump has been manufactured as a cultural symbol for quite a long time now, and perhaps this is we're reaping the results of that. And the last thing I want to comment on is this notion of doom, and I think that's quite right. There is this sense of foreboding about this particular election coming off the back of the first Trump term, and I think really we've been thinking about this election ever since January the 6th. And this, if you like, is the sequel to what happened there. And so I think there's this growing, particularly now we're a month away from the election, this growing sense of foreboding about political violence. I wonder how many of you here watched the film Civil War, the Alex Garland film, which is a really wonderful piece of cinema, sort of biggest budget indie flick I've ever seen, art house flick I've ever seen. And I think that's a film that could only have been made in today's post-Trumpian era. One could never have conceived a plot for a film like that 20 years ago, for example, even during the War on Terror and the post-9/11 era. So we are in a deeply unsettling time for America. I co-authored an article that's going to be released in the Journal of American Studies in the next month or so look out for it. And I think this story, there's going to be a post-Trump era at some point. The question is, what will be the manner of that ending? Will it be with a bang or with a whimper? And will it be this time around, or will it be 4 years from hence? And how will America be left looking, I think, in the post-Trumpian era? So I'm going to finish it there, I think.
Thank you. You made this point about the fundamentally incompatible visions, right, for the United States that the two campaigns and their supporters hold. And with that in mind, Kat, I wanted to turn to you. The Trump campaign has portrayed America as a country under siege from the outside. Right? The Harris campaign talks about this election often in terms of internal threats. That's also been a message from Biden throughout his time in office, particularly after the events of the 6th of January, 2021. As somebody who's you've written on the threats and the challenges of domestic extremism, you also have a job that puts you on the ramparts, looking out to what may be trying to come in. First of all, how worried are you about either of these threats, and how worried should American voters be?
I'm going to start by saying it's lovely to be back. I'm going to start with the work side and then get to the personal side. But I have to say that lovely quote, all views are my own, and they do not represent the views of the United States government or Customs and Border Protection. We love to hear it. So I think when it comes to the border, which is such a hot topic, and in relation to Trump's rhetoric, I, as an employee of the federal government working for an agency and under the Department of Homeland Security, if we base that kind of fear in reality, I have friends that have volunteered, so coworkers that have volunteered to work at the border for a month or so just to help out the current permanent staff that's there. And it's overwhelming for them. We don't, again, all views are my own. We have never really figured out a proper system that balances security and with efficiency and processing individuals and families that are entering the United States. That has never been achieved, and I don't know when it ever will be. But for the coworkers that have been down there to assist, it's overwhelming for them. It's emotionally taxing. There are a lot of folks that they have to process. They're helping out with making lunches and translation. And so if you're looking at it from that perspective, there's a lot going on. There are a lot of folks that are coming in. And I would not say that is, personally, would not say that is under siege. That is not a larger administration, but lowercase administration, administrative issue. So from that perspective, I think that, and using different terminology, it is overwhelming. It's happening every day. It's happening right now. But if we look at the emotive language that he uses and what the terms and the terminology that he says in his speeches and on Twitter or X, etc. It's a more insidious message. Let me take a look at my notes here. So when he riles up fear when he's speaking about immigration, about the border, about the us versus them, he makes migrants the threat. That's not new to anyone. But But he says that they're taking jobs. He says that they're dangerous people. He uses inflammatory language such as rape and murder, and talks about, I apologize for saying this, but eating the dogs, eating the cats, etc. Like I just have to say it. But when he uses that language, he wants individuals to feel as if they are at the front lines. He's using like conflict language and making folks feel as if that they're unsafe just walking around and doing everyday things. I think that there are certainly parts of the U.S. That haven't been exposed to having migrants in their town, and this could be a relatively new thing. They're not familiar with diversity in the way that other parts of the United States have been. And he uses that to make it feel as if this is a dire situation and you need to vote for him. I think that he also uses that language saying that like religion and Christianity is vanishing if you don't vote for him. Traditional family values will disappear if you don't vote for him. And I think that the more insidious part is what he's, either consciously or subconsciously, what he's trying to get at is that whiteness is under siege. And there are multiple reasons why people would vote for Trump, but the hostile language that he uses definitely is inspiring and is enabling a lot of hate. And you can have 5 different people in a room listening to what he's saying, and they get 5 different takeaways from that, and some of them are violent. So from my personal perspective, I think that's it's definitely dangerous. I'm not looking forward to anything that is similar to a January 6th. I remember on that day, or a few days ahead of that, my parents were like, "You should come visit. You don't need to be in DC." And I'm like, "Why are my parents so worried about this?" And like me, like haven't gotten my degree from King's yet, hadn't studied terrorism studies just yet. I was like, I don't need to. I think I'll be okay. And then getting text messages from my friends and asking them if they're safe, and telling them like, if you want to come into, if I can get you into my apartment building, if you just call this number and I can buzz you in. Like that's the level we were at. I don't personally want to return to that, but unfortunately, I think that might be on the table.
Thank you. Sobering. We're going to pick up on a lot of that. I'm going to come to the audience in a moment, so please do get your questions ready. We're going to have a couple of people running around with microphones, so get your hands warmed up. But before I do that, Stephen, I want to bring it home a little bit. We are in London, right? Britain has, I think, historically been torn, and particularly in recent years and decades, between the quote-unquote special relationship with America and the relationship with Europe, which is maybe less special, but in many ways more intimate, as our own UK and a changing Europe has demonstrated over the years. In terms of British foreign policy, what hinges on the outcomes of this election?
Yeah, so I would start off by saying that the UK's relationship, I don't really think is that intimate with the EU anymore. When we are in Brussels, it is very clear that they do not think about the UK very much, and that relationship is really seen as one that is a divorcee, that they might have to be seen at their friends' parties, but they really don't want to be at the table very much. And that has naturally taken the US, that the UK has then very naturally been drawn to the US. This is not just in foreign policy, in trade as well, as there's been a desire to become closer to the US, its largest trading partner as a single country, but also within foreign policy. However, in a post-Brexit UK, Britain stands at a very difficult crossroads because the US is very clearly becoming more protectionist. They, under a Democratic party, are becoming more isolationist and protectionist in their policies. Now, what's interesting about that is that we saw parts of that under a Trump presidency as well, and yet both of those have been taken different approaches. Under a Biden presidency, that has been done under the banner of one of the largest environmental packages ever passed to combat climate change. And under a Trump presidency, his tariffs and kind of war on all of that was actually done in a kind of make America great, therefore make things in America again. And so what's interesting is the UK has a real difficult role to play right now, because by aligning themselves very closely with the US, they very likely within foreign policy will be ignored and not taken to the role that they think that relationship should have. Now, outside, let's look maybe at foreign policy at some of the biggest issues that is obviously happening right now. Ukraine being one of the biggest of those. The difference between the two presidencies, while maybe, or the two candidates and their administrations, while on a front like trade, they might actually react in similar ways that you might not expect. But with foreign policy, we obviously will see some of the biggest differences within defense policy. This is not new information whatsoever to anyone in this audience, that under a Trump presidency, the situation in Ukraine will get dire and will get dire quickly. Likely, Europe will be able to, and is already prepping itself for having to become less dependent on the US, whether it's through NATO or whether it's through defense procurement or whatever it is, that they are preparing for the possibility of a Trump presidency in which they lose that support. They are working to support Ukraine. However, they cannot provide enough support to allow Ukraine to win. Most likely, it will put it at a stalemate. It will drag on for a very long time. Under a Harris presidency, we will obviously see, I think, a continuation within that field. And I think it's actually in the UK's, that's a bad way to say that, but it is in the UK's interest that within Ukraine does bring the attention back to Europe from the US stance. Without that, I think that within foreign policy that the UK would not be paid attention to as much as they would hope. That, again, though, does put them in an interesting situation with foreign policy when it comes to Israel and Gaza. That is a situation in which it is very clear that we are starting to see a divide within the way that the EU sees if there can be called a resolution there, to the way that the US continues to support Israel. That divide will only deepen, and what side the UK continues to do, and obviously Stammer has started to show reluctance towards just being in lockstep with the US in response to that. But when it comes to other issues, the US will be and continue to be very self-centered and also be looking to its west and not to its east, and particularly with China. And what the US does there will affect the UK. The UK has always been, with this special relationship that they have, has always really emphasized being in lockstep, whether it was Blair with Clinton, whether it was Blair with Bush, and being in lockstep on many of those foreign policy issues. This, I think, will test many of the issues that we're facing with in foreign policy, will test that special relationship, in which way the UK feels more inclined to go towards Europe, a kind of aloof but still a neighbor and a close ally, or towards the US, in which either candidate I do think brings unpredictability, but with no surprise that a Trump presidency brings on a layer that is sometimes even hard to fathom. And I'll leave it there.
Okay, so we've got the lay of the land. There's a number of important issues that we've danced around but haven't grappled with. Mentioned but haven't dealt with: Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, climate change. Is a much longer list than that, but I'm counting on all of you to ask the really hard questions. So if you do have questions, please raise your hand. If you have a question to a specific panelist, please indicate that. Otherwise, we'll just take it back to the panel. So we can start with the gentleman in the baseball cap here in the. And sorry, before you that. This, as the panelists know, right, this conversation is recorded. It will be available for posterity, and that does include the questions that you asked. So,
It's okay.
Think carefully.
Yes, exactly.
Is it on? Yeah, okay, fine. Thank you very much. It was really, really interesting to hear from all of you. My question is about the Hurricane Milton, and I'm wanting to kind of know, as it's about to enter Florida, how that, on the back of the Storm Elen, will affect the election coming up. Kind of what will happen. Thank you very much.
Is this God's November surprise in October, October surprise in September? Whatever month we're on this track. Who wants to, hurricanes, impact of hurricanes on the election?
Shall I say something?
Sure.
Well, I mean, one way in which it could, the most concrete way, obviously, is as we look at the news and see how this hurricane is shaping up, it seems like truly dire compared even to the worst ones we're familiar with, is that it's going to create an enormous amount of destruction and displacement less than a month before the election. So there could actually be like concrete difficulties in running an election in terrain where people have been displaced to that degree. But more on the more political front, I mean, I guess it's maybe a good thing that the governor of Florida isn't the Republican nominee, because that would probably be posing all sorts of difficulties, because Ron DeSantis is down there right now. If Trump hadn't got the nomination, probably would have managing the situation. He seems to be quite concerned not to repeat what happened in 2012 when there was a big hurricane in New Jersey, and the governor there, Republican Chris Christie, was seen as being too overtly and visibly friendly to the Democratic-run federal government when it happened, and that damaged his political career in the long run. So there seems to be a kind of dance going on where the Democratic administration at federal level is trying to do what it can to help, because, of course, that's their job, first of all, and secondly, if they don't do that, it will reflect very badly on them, while the Republican administration at the state level tries to similarly make it work, but without making the relationship or the cooperation there too overt. Then, outside of all that, you have the Trump campaign, which is really just trying to demagogue the whole thing. We just saw with a previous hurricane a couple of weeks ago, which in a very geographically unlikely way ended up creating its worst destruction in inland Appalachia in North Carolina, which is not at all where you would normally expect this kind of flooding. And almost before the rain had fallen, you had J.D. Vance, Donald Trump, all of the people involved in the campaign out there saying the federal government is deliberately allowing this disaster to unfold because they don't, A, they're incompetent, and B, they don't like the constituency it's happening to. Totally disconnected from the facts, and the closer Republicans got to the ground, the more uncomfortable they were with that, but they didn't care because they wanted to make political points. So I think the Republicans on the ground in Florida will know that it's their job and necessary to focus on the actual emergency. The federal government will do likewise, but the Trump campaign is going to try to make anything that looks like a mismanaged event reflect well on them and reflect badly on the Biden administration, and therefore indirectly on Harris, which some might say is a bit distasteful, but not the most distasteful thing Donald Trump's ever done, so yeah.
Indeed. Yes, please, yeah.
And I think it's a fantastic question, and I think this is really, really actually important, precisely because of the point that was made earlier about what might happen if Trump doesn't win the election. So concerns about his reaction if he doesn't, and if there's any scope for any kind of question in Florida in particular, which has a history of contention. So the Bush v. Gore election in 2000 came down to what were called hanging chads, right? So a real contention over just a couple of hundred of votes, which decided the election in favour of Bush against a president who, in 2000, was really pushing an environmental agenda. And that was a real turning point in world history as well as American history for a vision of a slight environmental centerpiece in 2000. Imagine where we would be today if we did have something. And I think it ties not only directly to Florida and the hurricanes, but to the fact of the climate crisis that we are now in. So there's a lot of symbolic connections there as well as space for political real concern with what Trump might be able to do with it, despite Republicans.
Stephen, did you want to comment on that?
So the one thing I would say that actually very interestingly, there is possibility that because of the, I mean, this is one of the, I think the state's largest evacuation in history, that these people will not be able to come back to where they are from. Now, what is interesting is that since 2020, there has been a concerted effort by nearly every single Republican state to restrict the ability to vote, especially in ways such as mail-in ballots. That will come back to be a problem very likely in these places. And what also could be is that whether those people have a difficulty voting because they have to go either back to where they were from, that county, in order to be that count, or that the mail-in voting system has any issues with that. How they figure all that out will very much build out into this rhetoric of contention. We have to remember that the level of conspiratorial rhetoric that is happening in the United States is somewhat unfathomable. Already, on right-wing channels, on messaging boards and everything, it has become very, very common that there is a conspiracy theory that that this Hurricane Helen was actually man-made, was created by the actual federal government. That is something that we laugh at, but people believe this. People are sincerely so far down these rabbit holes that seems feasible to them. And I know that does not seem feasible to us, but I think that is so, it is so difficult to understand sometimes what the rhetoric and the beliefs that these people have. When we say it is a polarized United States, I mean, we are talking about levels of disconnect from what is reality that is so far removed that it's hard for us to even understand. And so that will, this hurricane, additionally, if there is any mishaps on how they roll out the kind of rescue efforts or the repair efforts, anything like that, that will be seen as a cover-up or as a inside job by the government, by this group. Now, this group is, well, we want to say this group is small within the United States, but it's difficult to know. I mean, the Republican Party, as of right now, there is a, I won't say the exact, because I don't want to misquote, but there is a vast majority of Republicans who believe that the 2020 election was stolen. That is a conspiracy theory. Therefore, if that is just the base Republican, what are those that are on the fringes believing? And so they will use situations like this. And these situations will be exacerbated by the rules and restrictions that were put in place by these very same governments.
And can I just one sentence to add? One of the things that was most at the heart of the 2020 election controversy was because the COVID pandemic was going on, ad hoc pragmatic changes to election rules necessitated by exigency. That's where all of the heat got focused. What does this make it more likely is going to happen in places that are devastated by the hurricane? Same kind of thing.
Sure.
We've had one, this is what happened, one question.
Yeah, we got really swept up by this question on the hurricane.
So I wanted to follow up 2 points. Neither of them are going to answer your question, but just show that it is a very good question. So I think that when it comes down to the hurricane, it doesn't, similar to the Haitian migrant story, it doesn't really matter sometimes if what that campaign says is true, but it depends on what the folks believe. So some things don't even need to be true for people to take action on that. So if there is a theory out there that says that it was constructed by the federal government, then people might believe that. I would also say, second point is, for the Department of Homeland Security, 10% of what the Department of Homeland Security is responsible for is the border, but that is what gets debated in Congress and how funding gets determined for the entire department. And unfortunately, FEMA has been used as a chip, and the funding has not been guaranteed because it's used as a bargaining chip, and that goes for other agencies as well. So
Same as the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yes, here in the front row, please. The red shirt.
Okay. What's going on in Palestine right now, I feel, is very important. And And I've heard Trump and Harris on, like they've both been asked what their stance is. And they both kind of have expressed support for Israel, well, at least from what I've seen. I don't really know. Which candidate do you think offers the best chance at peace, or at least like at any kind of possibility? Obviously, it's a very, very long-standing conflict, but you know, I'm just interested about who you think would provide any chance of a better outcome for peace.
It's a great question. Nobody wants to answer. I can do it. I went first last time. I want to do.
Well, I'll kick things off just by saying I think peace and what that means and what that can look like is something that has been sought for many, many decades. So any kind of true space of true peace, whatever that looks like, I think is extraordinarily difficult. So I want to problematize that word. But if you're speaking about sort of ending the violence that's going on and sort of de-escalating things, I think it's looking tough with both candidates. One thing that I'll say is a potential Trump administration. It will depend on who it is that starts to lead the charge in Trump's foreign policy making. But he does have a certain sect of individuals. You may be familiar with a man named Elbridge Colby, who represents a certain view of American foreign policy, which says, forget about Ukraine, forget about Israel, forget about the Middle East. The United States needs to entirely focus its foreign policy on China. And so there is a thread within people who are very influential in the Trump administration, in a potential Trump administration, who would take a very sort of all or nothing approach and redirect that way. I don't know if the extent to which that leads to peace, right? Again, I want to problematize that word, but that would definitely lead to change. And it would... Yeah, it would lead to change. But it depends, I want to emphasize on who it is that's advising a potential Trump administration. There are others who within the sort of potential foreign policy world of Trump who promote different visions. But Elbridge Colby is a particularly influential one.
Do you mind if I really quickly add? You know, obviously, Sama recently cut like a small amount of arms export to Israel. Do you think that there's any chance that the current, obviously there's a lot of funding and arms from the US to Israel, do you think that we see any reduction in that as people have been, you know, pleading for that for a long time now?
I would say, I mean, there is one thing to be said. It's difficult because Harris is part of, obviously, the Biden administration. However, still an individual, and we still are to see somewhat where she go, if she were to become president, where she would go with this. But I think this is an incredibly difficult, because I actually think that the U.S., that this problematic use of peace, or what we can call peace in an area that has not seen peace for a very, very long time, but at least a de-escalation of and a stop to the violence that is going on right now, is that it very likely will probably not come from the U.S. As much as they have tried to be these brokers of these conversations, that has not really been the case. And it very likely, I think that we need to maybe look away from a US-centric, that they will both solve the problems, they will likely exacerbate them, but there will be others, and we need to look at other players as well. That being said, though, if they are still supplying weapons, that is a very difficult situation to be in. And so I think that one thing that has to be said, though, is that a Trump administration, based off of their track record in the first Trump administration. When he moved the capital, the recognized capital from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, a very contentious decision. Additionally, enacting a Muslim ban within the U.S. does not give me any indication that he will be in support of any sort of peace that would be for, especially for Palestine. That it would be very likely a carte blanche for Israel. You could debate if they already have a carte blanche from the U.S. I mean, Biden does try to set red lines. As far as whether he enforces those red lines, I think is very, very debated. And the U.S. can do that, though they have not been very particularly good at in saying these are the red lines that we have, and really pushing hard against Israel. That being said, though, I do think that, well, it's a difficult question because I don't have a lot of hope that either are going to make significant inroads towards peace as we would like to see. Situation could get worse. So yeah, it's kind of a grim look.
I'm seeing a lot of hands in the room, so I do want to move on. I start there in the back, the lady in the vest. Yeah. Keep going. With the laptop, right? Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing the very inspiring comments. I have two questions. Do I need to choose one, or can I just ask
if you could do them both quickly. And I think what we might do is just collect a number of questions, bring them back to the panel, and just for efficiency. But yes,
okay.
Go ahead.
This is for everyone. So the first question is about the IRA. So after 2 years after the IRA has established and it's aimed to build domestic supply chains, helping out green transition, is energy and the issue of climate change still a defining factor for people in choosing who to vote? And the second question is on U.S. foreign policy towards China. Is there a big difference between how the foreign policy will be like under Trump or under Harris? Because it's like a general overarching aim for the U.S. to maintain supremacy. So would there be a lot of difference between decoupling and competition and keeping up the rivalry? Thank you so much.
Great questions. There was another hand in the back right there in that quadrant. Will, if you can turn right behind you, gentlemen in the glasses.
So, in the event of a Trump win, what sort of legislative battles do you potentially see between Democrat lawmakers and a Trump White House?
Okay. Let's come down here, and then we'll. Yeah. Sorry, all the way right down here in the front, also with the glasses.
Hi. I don't know if you were pointing at me, but okay. This is just a question actually about the vice president. So we recently had the vice presidential debate between J.D. Vance and Tim Walz. And it seems that in this current election cycle, we've had a more profound discussion and debate about the policies and views of the vice presidential candidates. Do you think, either under a Harris or Trump win, that the vice presidents will have any more say or sway over their presidential candidates? Because it seems, at least currently, that both sides are using the vice presidential candidates to garner more support, particularly in the case of Tim Walz. Thank you.
Great. And the last one for this round over here, and then we'll go back up.
Thank you very much. In case Trump wins next month, what do you think the implications of that would be on NATO for the next 4 years and European security, particularly in the context of Ukraine? Trump's been quite vague when it comes to Ukraine so far, but if he follows through on kind of some of his threats to disengage the US from the Ukrainian conflict, even partially, what does that mean for the rest of the NATO allies in Europe, such as Poland, the Baltics, the UK, when it comes to supporting Ukraine, and then the long-term kind of implications of the conflict? Thank you.
Okay, great. So, a number of questions. Climate change and voting, Trump v. Harris on China, Congress, which we haven't really talked about, but Congress is being elected as well, right? So we can take bets on who gets what. The role of the vice president and Trump, NATO, Ukraine, European security broadly. Nobody has to answer all of them, but why don't we start with Adam and go down the table and respond to what you what you want.
Okay, I'll just do a couple then, for the sake of politeness. I'll take a punt on legislative battles, and I'll go for one. One of the things that Trump seems determined to do, I was talking about his more focused policy machine for putting things into operation should he be elected this time. And one of the most concrete bits of it is that there's going to be a really large-scale, unprecedentedly large-scale, determined effort at immigration enforcement in the interior. So if we take the agenda seriously, there are north of 10 million undocumented immigrants illegally within the United States at the moment. There are some mechanisms for trying to detain them and deport them. It happens some of the time, usually if they cross paths with the criminal justice system in some other way. But there aren't roving state forces whose job it is to scour the interior for those people. The plan, if you believe Project 2025 and Stephen Miller and various other people, is to have a hugely amped up interior enforcement mechanism whereby you would essentially be trying to find, they say 20 million, I don't know quite where they're getting that number, most people think it's a bit high, but in the millions of illegal immigrants in the country, detain them for as long as it takes to then deport them from the country. And that is obviously on a scale that's never been done before. To do something on that scale is going to require an enormous amount of resources, and you can only mobilize those resources in the United States system of government with some degree of cooperation from Congress. So I would expect that there's going to be a combination of trying to get the resources to do that, and Congress, if it doesn't agree, maybe trying to insert itself in to stick a spanner in the works of that process if it gets underway purely on an executive action basis. That'll be my guess. Second point with regard to NATO, I forget who asked the question, but I'll have a go at that one. I mean, it's pretty clear that Trump is not invested in that set of security relationships. His conception of America's interests, the alliances that leads one to, is just different from the bipartisan consensus that predated him for many decades. Ukraine, of course, is not a member of NATO, so that's especially low-hanging fruit from the point of view of someone who wants to think about these things the way he does. I suspect he is probably going to cut that loose pretty early, and if Vladimir Putin doesn't somehow counterproductively provoke him and botch the job, that will be very bad news for them indeed. But I think Trump really showed that he wasn't interested in preserving NATO, core NATO itself, during the last administration. And it was one of those issues affected by the fact that, as I said in my opening remarks, he appointed a bunch of people as Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor, who just didn't agree with him about stuff. So they were always trying to distract him, hold America in. The US Senate, which at that point was manned by Republicans who didn't really think in a Trumpy way, was also trying to block it. This time round, more Republicans who think like Trump in the Senate, more people in the top foreign policy jobs who agree with Trump's basic idea that NATO is dispensable. I don't know if I'm going to go as far as to say the whole thing is going to be abolished, but to the extent that a lack of American commitment de facto makes NATO a far less effective thing, that would be a necessary implication of Trump coming to power.
Sorry. So I think I can try and answer the question about tariffs with China. I think a Trump administration would be unapologetically protectionist, even though those tariffs will probably hurt the importers more than China. I think a Harris administration would be more nuanced, but would still have be focused on, like, for climate change, like EV and chips and things like that. I think that those will probably still, there'll be a taste of protectionism with those items.
I'm going to also tackle the China question and bounce off that really nicely. So I think your question got to the heart of, right, what would happen under either administration in terms of US policy towards China. And part of my answer in terms of a Trump administration is what I was gesturing to earlier about it does matter who within his circles he ends up appointing to the most important positions in this space, so National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense in particular. If it were an Elbridge Colby, for example, it would be a kind of Trump administration's, or a kind of policy towards China that is very much about focusing on the geopolitical rivalry with China above all else, above all other kinds of relations with other parts of the world. So Colby is very much part of a school of thought that says you've got to focus in particular on the sort of geostrategic great power rivalry, end of story. The rest is a distraction. There are others within the Trump circles who are taking a slightly distinct position on China and what it might mean for them if they were in the Trump, or sort of had the sort of levers of power within a Trump administration. Most particularly, recently, Matt Pollinger and Mike Gallagher wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs speaking about sort of a vision that seeks more or less regime change within China. And this is a genuine position that is being considered and debated within sort of the circles around Trump. And that idea of regime change within China is certainly going to be, I mean, beyond the fact of its complete lack of understanding of the fact that, you know, any kind of regime change that America has sought to implement in its history has not only ended in disaster, but you know, it takes away the fact that, you know, what happens within Chinese politics is determined largely by China itself, right? But so the point here is that there are considerable debates about sort of a vision of what the United States should emphasize in its relationship with China within the Trump circle alone. Should it be about sort of forms of trying to push for regime change? Should it be about simply geostrategic rivalry? In the Harris administration, I think we're getting signs of what might happen there as well, with a lot of the debate that's happening at the moment more within the sort of liberal establishment within DC currently, where there is rumblings that are questioning what has been described as a consensus. So since the Trump administration came into power, so since when he actually was president, he implemented a really significant shift in America's China policy away from what was a broad church concept of engagement towards what he has deemed strategic competition. And the Biden administration has continued that Trump position in terms of China of strategic competition. There is rumblings happening within DC and the think tank world on people working on China policy who are beginning to push back against the idea that strategic competition that negates the significance of engagement may not be the way to go. And so because of that growing influence and conversations happening within sort of think tank worlds and DC, we may perhaps see a slightly more capacious understanding of what China policy should look like under a Harris administration, precisely because we don't have a full legacy of Harris's foreign policy sort of positions. She's not a foreign policy, you know, it's not her bread and butter. That actually opens the way for potentially a slight shift towards understanding engagement as not this thing that needs to be thrown out and sort of which has happened, and sort of understanding that competition doesn't sort of negate engagement. So this has been a conversation, I think, with very little hope. I'm gonna say that is a slight potential under a Harris administration. There are a lot of influential people making these points.
Thank you. Joe.
So I'm going to focus on the Trump win, the legislative battles, and the NATO question. I think the key thing that I would focus on thinking about a Trump win would be, of course, reproductive rights and abortion. Now, there have been 14 states that have enacted essentially outright bans. And so it seems as though this political schism or this political skirmish is going to stay located at the level of state legislatures as opposed to being raised to a federal level. Were Trump to win, I imagine that he would get a divided Congress. I couldn't see him winning both the House and the Senate this time around. So that will limit how far he presumably can enact an agenda on those on that issue. But it wouldn't mean good things for abortion rights and reproductive rights, I think, in the United States. And clearly this is something that Harris is running on. She's trying to mobilize her base, perhaps floating voters who are female, to turn out for her. The notion that female voters want their mothers, daughters, sisters to have that kind of autonomy over their bodies, that kind of freedom. So I think that's one of the key things to look out for, whichever candidate wins, and certainly if it's a Trump second term. I'd also make the point that there's this cross-pollination between different types of reactionary populism in Europe and the USA, and I think in many ways since 2016, Trump has become the blueprint for the reactionary populist. If you look at Orban, if you look in Hungary, if you look at even Meloni, who has an anti-abortion agenda. And so were Trump to take power for a second time, to have a second term, I imagine there would be a sort of soft, informal impact on European politics in terms of what's feasible to enact at the level of policy and politics to broaden this discussion into the area of restricting abortion rights, which have been anathema in Europe for quite a long time in general. On the NATO point as well, I would make the point that aside from any policy risks, I don't think withdrawal is a likely prospect, but we have seen a frosty relationship, I think, between the USA, certainly under Trump, and Europeans on the NATO issue. I think the key thing is that it undermines confidence in the alliance, and that confidence is really important. I think in an interesting way, Trump has hastened ever closer union at the European level when it's come to defence coordination, when it's come to thinking about developing an in-house strategy on European defence, not simply outsourcing it to the American planet. And I think certainly a second Trump term, as Stephen suggested, plans have already been set in motion from the European end to think about a contingency, in the event of a second Trump term. So there would certainly be, I think, a fragmentation of the Western alliance as it was classically conceived in the post-war period, and that would be quite a grave thing, I think.
Stephen, the panel has very kindly left you the questions on vice presidents and climate change.
Yeah, I actually was going to start with the vice president one, because that's an easy one. Okay, so will the vice presidents have any sway? No. Vice presidents don't matter. They never have. It's a sad fact, but they make very little difference in the actual voting patterns and the swaying of votes, even in swing states. Once they're in power, they hold far less actual power. We've even seen this, honestly, with Kamala Harris, where she was completely brushed to the side during a Biden presidency. She was actually mostly, the VP position is actually one that is supposed to be kind of the liaison with the houses, with Congress, so with the Senate and the House of Representatives. The problem is that Biden, having been in in the legislative branch for so long, preferred to do that job, pushing aside Harris quite quickly. Harris was only in the Senate for 4 years. So the last example we can actually have of a vice president doing anything was Dick Cheney, and we know how that ended. But no, unfortunately, just vice presidents, they don't make much of a difference apart from kind of setting them up to make a run for president. And so even with ones where, we kind of have both sides here, where J.D. Vance has actually seemed to hurt the Trump presidency by having so many gaffes, while Tim Walz has actually seemed to help the Harris candidacy. But in the end, it's so marginal that, and when it actually comes to it, probably not do much. What was the other one that? Oh, climate. Okay, yes. So IRA, not IRA, we don't use that here, but IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, that was obviously a massive piece of legislation, was incredibly significant, very influential and really big, did not take into account whatsoever the US's allies, aka Europe, the UK, the EU, the UK, even in Japan and Korea. They all had a lot of issues with the Inflation Reduction Act. But domestically, will this be an issue for voters? Will they see this as something that has done a lot? Unfortunately, we're really not seeing that effect very much. The Inflation Reduction Act has made a difference. It actually has done a lot. And I know that early on, the Biden campaign tried to kind of push on that and say, like, look what we've done. We've done a lot with like energy and like investment, whether it's into semiconductors and wafer fabs and all of this, and EVs and like all these things, making them built in America. And they've done a lot with that. Even if it is a very protectionist, has a very protectionist undertone to it. Unfortunately, I do not think that that is going to be much of an issue. When it comes down to it, the issues that voters care about is the economy. How do they feel? How do they feel worse off than they did? And then additionally, it's going to come down to individual or single issue voters. In this election, which will be very largely Gaza, abortion, and on the left side, and then on the right side, to be really honest, it's hard to say, because on the right side it will be abortion as well, but it also just will be the stop the steal, the election was stolen, and so those issues are going to be far more for the single issue voters, going to be far more prominent than issues such as, oh, what's happening with energy? Are we doing more with that? I think, unfortunately, yeah, it won't be as much of a conversation.
Great. Let's take another round of questions. Yes, here.
Thank you. I think it's fair to say that in both 2016 and 2020, polls systematically underestimated Trump. So I'm wondering, have pollsters changed their methodology? Can we rely on polls this time around, or will we experience the same systematic issue?
Good question. Up there in the back. Yeah, keep your hand up. Yeah.
So I was just wondering that in case Harris wins, do you think a civil war or something is possible, given how Trump reacted after the last election?
Okay, another easy question. Sorry to make you get your steps in today while I'm down here.
Thank you. How much of the election is going to be run on culture war versus concrete policy issues? Even on topics that the polls are important, like immigration, what is more significant in that topic? Is it actual policy, or is it just posture?
Policy versus posture? Let's see, you're in the middle.
I actually have a couple questions. I want to start off with you mentioned that they were going to deport, that's for the Project 2025, if people believe in that, they were going to deport 10 to 20 million immigrants. I want to say, how is that a bad thing if they came in the country illegally? And I also want to ask, you just mentioned about the vice presidents not having that big of a role, but actually, I just wanted to ask why that is. Like, for example, Kamala Harris was assigned to oversee the U.S. border, the Mexico border problem, which I think is quite an important thing. And she didn't really do much of a job. It took her like 100 days to get there. And I also wanted to ask about you were talking about peace in Ukraine. I think should it be that overcomplicated, as it's quite a simple thing in my opinion? The term peace. Like overall, just peace in the world right now, and I think it's got a pretty basic meaning. It's either peace or there's either war, and I think we can all agree that there was no war during the 4 years that Trump ran. And and I also wanted to ask if you think 75 billion is.
Sorry, we had a lot of hands.
Just one more question. I also think, do you think 75 billion is quite a lot of money to be spending on Ukraine? Because of the issues that America is currently facing. And I'm not saying that...
the gentleman with the name tag
on. Hi, good evening. Thank you for the panelists, first of all. But I'd just like to ask, would any, God forbid, escalation of the Iran-Israel conflict indirectly benefit Donald Trump if oil prices would, God forbid, rise to like more than $100 per barrel? And second of all, if Joe Biden said that Netanyahu, he doesn't know if Netanyahu would better the US election in favor of Donald Trump, but if the oil, what I had said would be true, for example, oil prices rise and Donald Trump eventually get elected because Americans are concerned about oil prices, gas prices, what would the panelists say about that? Thank you.
Thanks, good question. And then right in front of you. Yep, right there.
So in her recent interview, Harris stated that she would use guns she apparently owns if someone was to break into her house. So my question is this more a PR strategy to attract Republican voters, or it's a sign that if she becomes the president, no policies will be implemented to stricter gun control regulations to implement that, yeah?
I think we're going to have to leave it there. I will say, however, that I think there is some opportunity for informal conversation and continuation afterwards. So let's bring it back to the panel. Maybe, Stephen, since we left you with the dregs last time, maybe we'll start with you this time, and Adam can pick up the slack.
Perfect. I get my pickings. Okay. Let's see. We'll start. Okay, polling. Can we trust the polling more this time? I wouldn't say yes. And the reason I wouldn't say yes is because nobody knows. I do not believe anybody can say with confidence what the outcome of this election will. And the reason for that is that because of the US system, the Electoral College, it comes down to such a small number of votes, about 100,000 votes scattered about in a few key states. That is so difficult to be able to poll correctly, precisely, and predict within those numbers how that's going to play out. Obviously, we saw in 2016 a massive kind of this silent Republican that were not polled, that were very disenfranchised and disgruntled with what had happened throughout all of the financial crisis and had not been listened to and wanted a shakeup in policy and had not been and didn't vote. And so they usually, because they didn't have a history of voting, were usually kind of deprioritized or de-weighted in those type of polling and all of that. They tried to do better with that in 2020. Obviously, though, with COVID, that mixes things up. I think that we have to take polling with a grain of salt and really say we don't know for sure how it's going to play out because of the reasons I just said with that. That it's just the margins are so small there. Okay, let's see. I'll do another one. Harris guns. Is this? Okay, what do we think about it? It sometimes is really hard to understand gun culture within the United States. It is so prevalent and is seen as such an intrinsic right for people to have that Harris, I think, yes, maybe a little bit of NPR posturing here and trying to look at all of the voters and trying to kind of appeal to them. Here is the fact of the matter. One way or the other, is gun policy going to actually be put through? No. And the reason is because the way that, what we kind of talked about a little bit before this with what are the legislative battles going to be, the legislative battles are going to be gridlock and there's going to be almost no legislation passed because of the way that the US system is built and both because of a deep partisanship where there most likely is going to be divided houses and the filibuster, which then requires a 60% vote, which is so difficult to get. Neither party is going to get 60% in both of the houses that when they'd be able to kind of override those filibusters. And therefore, no actual meaningful legislation is really going to likely get through. The way that they are able to even push legislation through right now is through these loopholes within budgetary kind of frameworks that allow them to cram in a bunch of funding for things as items of a budget. And so issues with gun rights would be much more difficult. With the Supreme Court that we currently have, it would very, very likely go to the Supreme Court. And with jurisprudence being completely out the window, who knows what that would be. But most likely, in a gun rights, it would uphold the second. And so it would be very difficult to see anything meaningful actually happen there. Let's see. I guess you asked me about why VPs don't have power. I'll get that, and then I'll kind of move on to the rest of the panel. Why VPs don't have power? I mean, that I think is just very ingrained into the history of the U.S. and the VP position in general. It really was kind of seen. I mean, originally the VP was whoever lost the election became the VP. If you've seen Hamilton, you can you know that a little bit. But that is not a position that has ever held a lot of power, really ever historically, and so it's not really built out in a way that has been very effective because the president wants credit for the big things, and therefore the vice president is given smaller tasks or tasks that are seen as maybe more difficult, or it really kind of depends, but they know it's very, very rarely that they are able to create a platform that is recognized and gives them kind of a national profile in the way that you would expect. It's just kind of how the system's built.
Okay. Well, so I'm going to address, I'll try and address 4 of those, and I'll leave the border and foreign policy stuff to my colleagues over here. So in terms of the polling, that's a great question. And yes, I think there's a very real possibility that there is a shy Trump voter effect that just isn't captured in the polling. And that's very possible. I mean, Harris has a lead of about 2.8% right now. She's ahead coming out of the most recent debate compared to Trump. But Trump does have a certain appeal. I don't think that his appeal among floating voters is lost. I think he has such a platform which stems from his celebrity going back decades that gives him a very powerful platform. And, he speaks a demotic, simple language that undeniably connects with people. Part of the reason that all of us are probably in this room so interested in this election is because of Donald Trump. That's the very strange thing is even, deeply liberal people feel fascinated by him. And so we must not, I think you're right, underestimate that effect, which polling might not pick up. In terms of civil war, if I got that question right, I don't think there's any risk of immediate... It depends what we mean by civil war. I think what we are seeing is a more polarized and less stable political culture, and the deep amount of division is in itself a real risk. I think that's more likely to be mid to long term, as opposed to an immediate crisis. It won't be the Alex Garland style movie version. But the fact that certain democratic institutions and processes are becoming a wedge issue is something that ought to, I think, give Americans pause for, and all of us pause for thought. On the cultural politics stuff, yes, I think a lot of it is posturing. I think the way that we consume politics today tends to be in terms of not even sound bites, but sort of, TikTok videos, in terms of very digestible content that connects with us emotionally. I think that's part and parcel of the world that we're in, and just the way that we communicate with one another. So I think that's absolutely right, that there is this shift in how we actually consume politics. And finally, on the gun issue, I very much doubt that Harris will waste political capital on that issue because it's so hard to get movement on it. She will be dealing with a very gridlocked Congress if she does win the election. I think she's likely to resort to executive orders in order to enact her agenda, much like Obama did. But yeah, we'll see, I think, more and protracted shutdowns over the next 4 years if she does win the election. And I defer to my colleagues over here.
Great. We had a lot of questions. I actually wanted to add some thoughts on some things that have been covered and take them in different directions. Because I thought the culture wars question, if I understand what you were asking, was you were asking about, if I'm right, the connection between these sort of the ways in which ideas get whipped up politically and actions, policy actions that get in place, and sort of weighing through, maybe this is my way I've interpreted your question, but weighing through how we can understand change within sort of all kinds of societies. This is a question about how does change occur, really. And I think one thing to keep in mind when we look at one of the major culture wars issue within the United States at the moment, and that is abortion. It is a very, in relative terms to American history, relatively recent space in which such amazing capacity to whip up cultural feelings of such intense and emotive forms has happened really only particularly since the 1970s. And that the capacity for the Supreme Court more recently in the 21st century to overturn Roe v. Wade is a concrete policy outcome that's a consequence of a much longer sort of cultural transformation that Republican and evangelical actors actively organised to whip up over decades. And so I think it's really important when we're looking more broadly at concepts of change and continuity, or how do human societies operate. Policy actions are often the culmination of significant amounts of cultural conversations and change that have happened, sometimes with very organised efforts, as in the case of this particular issue. And so policy action, therefore, and if I'm gonna continue with the hope line, I'll be the hope person for this panel, because we do need to, I think, remember that the future isn't written. I'm a historian. Nothing is inevitable. No one can know what will happen, and that actually is a space for hope. That is a space for remembering that change is possible, and that there's no certain sort of inevitability of any kind of outcome. And where that matters at, I think, a cultural level, is that cultural transformation is extremely important. And therefore, as individuals within a society, how we intersect and how we build upon a cultural set of norms is really important for political outcomes too, even if they don't feel direct. And so I've given you a very direct one, this is the issue of abortion, but this is a much larger sort of conceptual point that I wanted to make, wearing my academic hat. I'll very quickly, because I want to sort of defer to the rest of my panel, but I want to make a point about the vice president, actually. Its role doesn't matter until it does, right? As in, politically speaking, Biden had no other option, politically speaking, to go with anyone other than Harris. The same as Gerald Ford, right? Gerald Ford became president because he was vice president. So the vice president doesn't matter until they do. And then they become president. So in terms of whether Vance or Waltz are going to shift voters' preferences right now in the coming election, maybe not. But do they matter potentially at being the next commander-in-chief? Yeah. And we've seen it in American history, and we're living the consequences with a Harris nominee, right, or a Harris candidate. I'm going to leave it there.
Thanks. Kat?
Yes. So whoever asked the polling question, the first thing that came to my mind is, I don't know who's going to win the election, none of us do, but I think that the Trump campaign has prepared for and set the stage for, if he doesn't win, how they're going to handle that and try and make it benefit them, similar to what happened last time. I think that they are more prepared. I think when it comes down to getting those election votes certified, even like local level, I think they've already prepared for that, which I'll just leave it at that. And then the other question, posturing actual issues, I think we saw it with the presidential debate, that it was about where do you stand, what do you believe, versus actual plans. There weren't really concrete, or not concrete, but detailed plans for either campaign. So I think that, in my view, that answers that question.
Thanks.
Well, I think I'm all that stands between people and a drinks reception, so I'll try to be efficient in what I say. I think one of the questions was about how we got into this situation in terms of immigration and the quantity of illegal immigrants in the interior, a kind of combination of neither party prioritizing this issue until about 15 years ago, the asylum system being essentially broken in terms of the number of people who are coming through it, vastly outstripping the resources that are available, and political gridlock which has prevented legislation that would be required to either increase resourcing to enforcement in such a way as to make that work as it should, or to regularize the status of the people who have been there illegally for almost their entire lives. And so those reasons have kind of come together to create this problem. The intent of the Trump administration would be to try to resolve it in an extremely ruthless and enforcement-heavy way. If you poll that abstractly, you can find a lot of Americans who support it. I would bet you any amount of money that once it began to happen, you would have a thermostatic public opinion backlash as people who are in people's communities start getting pulled out of houses and shipped out of the country. So I bet it's one of those things that electorates like when it's polled in theory and would like a lot less in practice. On polling, with the Trump, I mean, it's never a great position to be in as any politician when you basically depend on a bunch of secret voters who the polls can't pick up and who are low propensity to turn out. But Trump does seem to get them, and so the idea that they're there somewhere is always on people's minds when we're doing this polling. They do try to change each time to pick them up better. I heard this time that one of the polling companies, when they called people up and the answer they got was, "I'm voting for Trump, go to hell," and they just hung up. They didn't used to count that. Now they do, because the kind of person who votes for Trump doesn't like institutions and polling companies. So there are efforts like that to try and make it more accurate, although you never know. The one thing I would say is that there are some signs this time that the Electoral College advantage enjoyed by Trump might be declining. So for the 2016 election, the 2020 election, if it had just been a national popular vote election, the polls would have been right and Trump would have lost comfortably. They certainly would have been directionally right anyway. But it's just the fact that this rather odd Rube Goldberg device that wasn't even designed to be playing this role kind of persists in the Constitution that allows certain results in particular states to be overly influential. And Trump got small majorities in the right states for it to really be decisive. Nate Cohn, the sort of data journalism polling guru in the New York Times, wrote recently that there are some signs in the data that maybe the Republicans who have had that electoral college advantage the last couple of times aren't going to have it in the same way this time. So the idea that Kamala Harris needs to win the popular vote by 3-4% just to win, that might not actually turn out to be true. And finally, Kamala Harris, she has a gun indeed, it's a Glock. I think she clarified in her most recent interview, and she's not afraid to use it down the shooting range. I don't think she's ever had cause in any other context. I think that reflects the Democratic Party's deliberate choice to moderate across a number of issues. Immigration, crime, and guns have all been things they really don't want to make salient because they feel they can win over a certain kind of marginal voter. And because of the Second Amendment, and because of who's on the Supreme Court, and because of the makeup of Congress, it's just not going to happen, like massive anti-gun legislation. So if you're going to give something away for the sake of being seen to moderate, why not that? So absolutely do not count on any what you would recognize as meaningful gun restriction legislation from the Harris administration.
Thank you. Well, just to sum up, I think it's quite clear that this is going to be the most monumental U.S. presidential election since the last U.S. presidential election. But the reality, right, is that the differences, I think, are not really where we expected them to be. The differences are in the nuances, and you've really helped us identify those and think hard about what we're going to face in the weeks and the months and the years to come. So please join me in thanking Adam Quinn, Elizabeth Ingleson, Josephine Harmon.